You know, I like trains. When you see a locomotive on a CP or CN train, you'd usually know what type it is by just looking at it or looking up the number. For example, here's a GEVO, here's an SD40-2, and here's a GP9RM. But what you may not know is that a whole ton of Canadian railways like CP, CN, and VIA, and even GO Transit have their own classes for locomotives. Hey guys, this is, and I hope you're doing well after getting through that absolute show known as 2020. Am I? No. In this video, I'll attempt to guide you through 4 railways' weird locomotive classifications. Let's start off with, as the Redditors and Discord moderators would say, the most based and red-pilled railway, CP RIP. CP's diesel classes are pretty easy to understand, and for the the average foamer who doesn't care about the fancy names, CP is nice enough to give the builder's classification beside their class, or neither at all in some engines. CPs for the most part consist of 3 letters, 2 numbers, and 1 extra letter for the subclass. The subclasses may have been carried over from the steam era, as many have subclasses similar to the locomotives of that era. For example, the D10 steam engines were grouped into 10 subclasses: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, J, and K. However, I think depending on the amount of locomotives there were in a series, the subletters may have been for batches of locomotives. Like for example, 1000 to 1010 were batch A, and 1011 to 1029 were batch B. I'm honestly not too sure about the subclasses of steamies, so if you know, let me know in the comments. Anyways, now for the main part of CP's classes, the D stands for diesel. Pretty simple. The D could be followed by an FA, FB, PA, PB, RF, RS, and S. The second letter would be for what the locomotive is used for. F would be for freight, and P would be for passenger service. Now the third letter after the F and P letters would signify that the unit is either an A unit or a cabless B unit. For example, DFA would be a diesel-powered freight unit with a cab. DPB would be a diesel passenger locomotive without a cab, like CP 1900. Now as for the others, RF stands for road freight, like an AC 4400, and RS is a road switcher, like a GP7U. Sometimes CP's units don't even have a second letter. For example, CP SW1200 1211 was classed as a DS12 unit. Fun fact, 1211 was actually exported to Africa recently. Take care of my engine, my African BRUDDAS. Wakanda forever! Note to self, cut that joke out. Now I'm not sure about this either, but in some cases, there's 3 numbers. CP5021, an SD30 Eco, is a DRS30AA locomotive, and 4421 is a DRF440. CP actually had some other locomotive classes. For ERF, I'm not too sure what that is. It's apparently a continuation of DRF after 30Z, and all of the DRF30s are some form of SD40s. Others include HB, which stands for hump booster, such as CP1019, HS, which stands for a hydraulic switcher like CP10, CLC DT2, classed as an HS5, and SB, which stands for SpongeBob. Just kidding. SB actually stands for Switcher Booster. For example, CP's B100 series were slug units used in yard service. I'm sure you guessed it already, they were in the SB class. Fun fact, CP B100 was probably the longest lasting SB unit, being built in 1951 with the others, converted into a scale test car in 1982, and was likely scrapped in 2009. Now as for the numbers, it's really simple. The numbers, usually there's 2, stand for the amount of horsepower the locomotive has. For example, the DT2, or as they're listed by CLC as the 44H44A1, had a 5 in the class name. It had two 250 horsepower diesel engines, making the total horsepower count 500. Now as for the 2 number units, they're just units with over 1,000 horsepower. For examples, the GP9s are DS17s, which are diesel switchers with 1,750 horsepower. The AC4400s, 4400 CWMs, and the first and second gen GEVOs are DRF44s for diesel road freight units with 4,400 horsepower. Now to wrap up CP's segments, here are some examples. An HS5 would be CP22, a hydraulic switcher with 500 horsepower. An HB15 would be CP6801, 1500 horsepower hump booster unit. A DS17 would be CP1683, a diesel switcher with 1750 horsepower. A DRS20 would be CP3019, a diesel road switcher with 2000 horsepower. A DRF30 would be CP5866, a diesel road freight unit with 3000 horsepower. A DFA16 would be CP4070, the funny AM road locomotive, a diesel freight A unit with 1600 horsepower. A DFB16 would be CP4466, a diesel freight B unit with 1600 horsepower. A DPA17 would be CP1405, a diesel passenger A unit with 1750 horsepower. A DPB17 would be CP1919, a diesel passenger B unit with 1750 horsepower. And now, on to the other 3 railways, Via, CN, and So CN, Via, and GO Transit's classes are very closely linked, as they were at one point all owned by the Canadian government. Oh yeah, I'm saying GO like that, as it seems to be a running gag with some friends, who know who they are, that most Canadian rail fans like Jason Schron from Rapido Trains and I say GO with a funny Canadian accent. To that I say take off, hoser. Anyways, they have 3 letters, 3 digits, and the last single letter would actually be for the locomotive batches. The first letter would be the manufacturer. C would mean the units were CLC, or Canadian Locomotive Company built, which are basically Canuck-made Fairbanks Morse units. E is actually for General Electric, or GE, and not EMD. G is for EMD, or technically GMD. M is for Montreal Locomotive Works, or MLW, as well as ALCO, American Locomotive Company, and Bombardier units. L would be for Miscellaneous Builders. Who exactly? I have no idea. The next letter would be for what the unit is used for. C is, I assume, for commuter use. F is for freight use. H is for hump use. S is for switching use. Y is for yard use. R is for road switchers. And P is for passenger use. Finally, the third letter would be for the configuration of the locomotive. A and B are obviously for units with or without cabs. G is for road switchers with steam generators for passenger service. L is for units leading sets of engines in hump service. And I'm not sure what the E is for on the GO units. Possibly the electric head-end power generators, I'm not too sure. And T is for trailing engines in hump service. Hold it! I actually got asked by someone on the Engines of NAR GP9 video what the T stood for on some of the road slugs the NAR units got converted to. Well, now you know. Come to think of it, now I know. The last 1 or 2 digits are for the horsepower amount, and the digit before them, being either a 4 or a 6, would signify that the unit had either 4-axle or 6-axle trucks, like say a GP40 or a SD60F. And lastly, the little letter at the end of the class is for the batch. Early units, for example 2500, would have an A at the end, meaning it was one of the first locomotives of the type. Now to wrap up CN's segment, here's some examples. An EF644A would be a GE freight unit with 6 axles, 4400 horsepower, and part of batch A. A GPA30B is a General Motors passenger A unit with 3000 horsepower and would be part of batch C. Essentially an F40PH. An MPA18B would be an MLW built passenger A unit with 1800 horsepower, part of batch B, like VIA 6789, or what most people would recognize it as, CN 6789. At the, I don't know, some museum in Chirac. A GCE 430H would be a GMD built commuter engine E with 4 axles and 3000 horsepower, part of batch H. And lastly, a GF630B would be a General Motors freight engine with 6 axles, 3000 horsepower, and part of batch B, like CN 6016, an SD40. I know it's not a straight SD40 now, but since nobody knows what to call it, an SD40U, an SD40-2Q, I'm just going to call them SD40s. Other railways linked to the CN, like the Duluth, Winnipeg and Pacific, Grand Trunk Western, or the Central Vermont, had a bit more simple classifications that remind me of CPs. Like for example, GTW EMD GP9 number 4558 was classed GR17A. DWP MLW RS11 number 3607 was classed MR18A, and CV MLW S4 number 8081 was classed MS10J. It seems after a while they dropped the Canadian classes, as most units were seen without them by the 1970s and 80s. Well, I hope you learned something through this video about CP, CN, VIA, and that railway's locomotive classes. Thank you for watching. This is the Winnipeg Railfan saying be wise with your money and invest in crystal meth. Okay, bye.
Hamster.